and the lower class over time will become cognitively incapable of understanding what AI is doing to them and how it's molding their opinions, and will become dependent on AI for everything, and will not really be able to function without it or even make their own decisions and know their own preferences.
Welcome, everybody, to this Peak Prosperity podcast. I'm your host, Chris Martinson. Today, we are speaking with the author of Nation Under Blackmail and a main contributor to the unlimitedhangout.com website, and a guest who's been on the program before, the one, the only, the inestimable, and very smart Whitney Webb, possibly the greatest dot-connecting investigative journalist of our times.
Wow,
Whitney, hey, welcome back to the program.
Great to be here. What a flattering introduction. Thank you.
I meant every word of it, and I'd like to start at the top if we could. I like to work from the top down or outside in. Burning question. The burning question to set all this up is, we're up against the plots, are we up against the plots of evil geniuses, or are we suffering under the tyranny of midwits, doing the best they can, but leading us to ruin? That is, how much of what we're experiencing in your estimation today is intentional, and how much is accidental?
Yeah, so I think, I tend to view most of what's going on as intentional, and I think they use the perception of what they're doing as incompetence as a way to cover up for their crimes a lot of the time. So I think ultimately what we're seeing is an effort to sort of herd the world towards what I would refer to as a neo-feudal model. So sort of going back to the same concentration of power that existed in the feudal era, or the dark ages of Europe, as it were, where you sort of have kings and you have sort of their enforcer class, and then you have a large serf underclass, and that the goal is to have basically those strata, the differences between them, enforced by technology, I think a key component of that is the efforts to control the flow of information, because in that era, right, the church dominated the flow of information and knowledge, and a lot of this was later, spread around and distributed to the serf class through the printing press and things like that, and now in modern iterations, the internet. And in order to bring things back to the neo-feudal era, the powers that be have to take complete control of the internet and the flow of information, and I think that's why we're seeing this increased push of censorization, and also to have, AI, generative AI that they produce end up producing the lion's share of the content online. Those two things, I think, go together in order to sort of manufacture reality so that we're more easily controlled and herded into these various systems that they're setting up that will maintain the vast majority of the populace in this serf underclass. And a lot of the big establishment thinkers on AI have pretty much talked openly about how that technology is being used to create sort of the upper class, the kings of the data barons, I guess, of the modern era, as opposed to the oil barons of previous eras, and how, the people that control the data that AI trains on and the people that program and maintain AI will be sort of in this upper class, and that AI will act upon the lower class, and the lower class over time will become cognitively incapable of understanding what AI is doing to them and how it's molding their opinions, and will become dependent on AI for everything, and will not really be able to function without it or even make their own decisions and know their own preferences without it. And, this was laid out by people like former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, Henry Kissinger, figures of that variety, openly talking about how this is where this technology is taking us.
Now, that's a fascinating summary, because this is sort of the edges of what I've been poking around at for a while here, which is that, once upon a time, you had to keep slaves, and that was a problem because they ran away and you're responsible for feeding them, their medical care. It was a problem. And then debt-based money came along, and surprise, people became their own slaves and slave masters. It was awesome. Very good. I'm wondering if we aren't seeing this transition now from old money. What's the new currency? It's information. If you can convince people of this narrative that you want them to be convinced of, and you can do that really powerfully, maybe subtly, maybe understanding neurochemistry, biology, pathways, wiring.
Yeah, so I think information is absolutely crucial to developing this neo-feudal model, precisely because If they can manipulate how humans perceive reality, they can fundamentally shape human behavior. And I think that's really the ultimate goal of this. And I think, during the COVID era, for example, that was a big boon for them in terms of like the lockdowns and all of that, because people weren't interacting so much with the real world. They were instead interacting with the online world chiefly, which they can manipulate more effectively and essentially create realities that don't necessarily exist and convince people that that's what's happening, and manipulate trust also. And as I'm sure you and your audience are aware, the big theme at like the World Economic Forum for the past several years, including this year, has been rebuilding trust and how to claim trust or reclaim trust among the people who have sort of, to varying extents, gotten wise to this essentially big power grab that's happening on the part of the elite right now. So narrative management is a big part of it. And the internet has been an issue for them in that regard, in terms of allowing whoever, anyone to publish information or read, and for people to read that information, hence the increased efforts to not just censor, but also have them through AI produce the lion's share of content. And I think it's been said now that ChatGPT and generative AI like it is going to be responsible for like 90% of content online by 2025, which is, a year from now. So obviously those agendas are marching forward quite quickly. And I'm sure as the 2024 US presidential election approaches, there will again be unprecedented censorship efforts that even the pro-free speech platform owned by Elon Musk, X, formerly Twitter, has embraced, as have, the more legacy social media platforms that don't take that, free speech posturing. Like Facebook and Google and what have you. So I think, we'll see a renewed push for that, for the purpose of narrative control, because it's very likely that the 2024 election is going to be, contentious, because essentially the dynamics for that have been set up over the past two US presidential elections. Essentially, the side that loses, regardless if it's Democrats or Republican, are going to contest the results. And there's obviously going to be, issues there, and the potential for either a January 6th equivalent among Democrats, or, a supposed repeat of what they hoped January 6th would turn into, because in my opinion, that was an event that they really essentially a false flag to sort of push through the domestic terror narrative. And even with all those efforts there, it didn't really stick, because, there was not really a very small death count there. And despite the comparisons to try and link January 6th in the public mind to 9/11, after that event took place, it didn't end up sticking that way. But I think, over the course of this year, it's very possible that there will be some events and crises they will try to frame that way. And I think at the end of the day, the solution that will be offered to the public is going to be, a regulated internet, increased control over internet, the end of the ability to have anonymity or privacy online, which of course is going to tie into the broader efforts to eliminate financial privacy as well.
And now a word from our sponsor. Hey, that's me. Hello, savvy individuals. Are you tired of sifting through the noise to find reliable information? Well, look no further. Welcome to Peak Prosperity, where we're not just a trusted source of actionable information. We're your passport to a community that's large and vibrant and full of like-minded folks just like you. Ever wish you could cut through the noise and get to the heart of the matter? Our team provides unbiased and trusted analyses of the news and events. Stay informed without the spin, empowering you to make decisions based on facts, not fiction. At Peak Prosperity, we offer more than just a steady stream of insights. We've fostered a large and growing community that's buzzing with energy. Connect, collaborate, and learn from people who share your passions. But that's not all. We're actually here to help you become more resilient, guiding you to make better, more well-informed decisions. In a world full of uncertainties, a Peak Prosperity membership is your key to exactly the information you need to prosper. Are you ready to join a community that's not just about information, but about empowerment and integrity? Subscribe to Peak Prosperity today and unlock a world of unbiased analysis, resilience, and meaningful connections. Because it's not just a subscription, it's a commitment to your success and the health and wealth of your family and business. And now, back to our content. Yeah, how do you go about distinguishing between a false flag and what I might call a real or an organic event?
Um, well, I would say that it probably depends on the event you're talking about. You know, in the case of January 6th, there were real people there for a rally, and there were various actors that were trying to make people think it was acceptable and legal for them to enter the Capitol grounds at that point. So, you know, that was obviously orchestrated not on the sense of the people, the Trump supporters that were, you know, let into the Capitol, but on the part of those that did the letting in, and you know, on the part of either Capitol Police or other figures, informants, what have you, that were like in the crowd posing to be Trump supporters and whatnot. That obviously suggests that there was some intentionality for things to develop that particular way for a particular purpose, being the dissemination of this narrative about Trump supporters and domestic terrorism, which was foreshadowed essentially a year before, where a top figure at DHS said that Trump supporters would do exactly that. In front of Congress, and saying that DHS could see it building and couldn't quite stop it, which, if you're as cynical as me, essentially amounts to them saying that we're going to create the conditions for this exact thing to happen.
Yeah, my one of my rule sets is if within 24 hours of the event there is lockstep talking points that went through some sort of obvious focus grouping, you know,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Insurrection, insurrection, insurrection. It was an insurrection right away, you know, and that was
Mm-hmm.
just blanketed because that's one of the things they do. They do that blanket coverage, which just sort of
Mm-hmm.
creates that narrative framework right away. Whereas, remember, I don't know if you remember, but I remember the DC snipers, Malvo and this other guy, right? Nobody knew what was happening. It was confusing. There were many narratives. They had wrong pictures of cars. Like it was all confusing. But when you get that crisp narrative right away, you know,
Yeah.
sometimes even before the event, oh, building 7 fell down, you know, like before it did, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
one of those moments makes me just go, might not be entirely organic.
Yeah. And then the other factor here in terms of the AI era in which we are stepping into is the potential for AI generated people to say things they didn't actually say, or for events, you know, through this whole deep fake thing to suggest that, you know, certain realities exist when in fact they do not, which is, you know, a whole different layer to all of this for sure. And
Yeah.
I'm sure is going to be very heavily weaponized, which is again why I think it's important for people to engage just as much in offline discourse as online discourse, just because if you are purely online and they are taking increased control of the virtual world, you're going to increasingly receive data and information that they are manipulating for their purposes. And I think right now we're seeing more of that than we truly ever have. So,
Yeah.
you know, being offline and engaging with people and seeing how things really are outside of the online world, I think is more important than it's ever been.
Yeah. I unfortunately consume a lot online because it's the nature of my job. And I find I have to
Likewise.
get out hazard, occupational hazard. And I'm worried that I'm being controlled. I'm worried that as sophisticated as I am, like I know that Twitter is shot through with bots and they've gotten increasingly sophisticated. They look and
Hmm.
sound like real people,
Hmm.
right? And just watching how they shape, they don't always just come out and go, you know, Chris, you ignorant human, right? They're very subtle. And it's not, I think that it's sophisticated enough that I am personally targeted. And I think everybody is to some extent because there's
Absolutely.
a, there's a file. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah. I definitely think that is what's happening. I think they have very individualized profiles on people that in part have been produced by AI and some of these big data mining firms that work for intelligence agencies like Palantir. And the goal of that is to basically, you know, the military and all of these groups, knowing that we know that they've invested millions of dollars in building essentially bot armies that are used to conduct influence operations. And we know they also do that against the domestic populace. And that, you know, this was legalized under the Obama era. They lifted the domestic propaganda ban and all of these other things with the NDAA, or one of the NDAAs in the Obama era. And all of that can be pointed at the US populace domestically for the purpose of advancing, you know, what these guys say is in the US's national interest, but increasingly it's in, you know, either the deep state or the power elite's best interest, which tends to be from preventing any sort of real change from happening that would lessen their power or prevent us from, you know, going even further down this this path that we are on. So, I definitely think it's, you know, open season for psyops in a way it never has been. And what I worry too, in this particular sphere, is that there's an increased effort because of their efforts to regain trust. What they're seeking to do is sort of to co-opt or use or lend people that don't deserve it anti-establishment clout, so that they can essentially act like they're going to deliver the change that people want. But they'll be delivering the same policies that their bases, their political bases, are against, whether that's digital ID or programmable surveillable money, or things of that nature, while claiming that they're against those things. As an example, with like central bank digital currencies, there's
Hmm.
also a dual effort by commercial banks to issue commercial bank digital currencies, which are also CBDCs under the names of deposit tokens or bank issued stable coins. And so, maybe figures like Trump and Ron DeSantis and some of these other figures have, said, oh, if we're elected or in power, there will be no central bank digital currency. But are they against, JP Morgan issuing, deposit tokens or stable coins that are just as programmable and surveillable as what, the central bank could issue? And is that really any better for prosperity and liberty of Americans? Is it better to be surveilled by Wall Street and have them program your money than it is to have the Fed? Quite frankly, not, especially when you consider that people like Jamie Dimon, for example, have come out on record saying they think private property should be seized in order to meet, UN climate goals and things of that nature. It's really ultimately the same thing at the end of the day. And so I think we're going to see, various efforts to try and herd people into the same system. But in order to have that happen, they have to convince people that the initiatives they're supporting are actually against this control grid to an extent, by
So
giving it different names and different appearances. But ultimately, it's fundamentally the same.
you mentioned a while ago that one of the things they fear is sort of the uncontained chaos of individual humans having a point of view and not doing exactly what they want them to do at all times.
Mhm,
And I was really surprised by, if we could, I like my fractal metaphors, and this was a big one, was the Canadian trucker protest, right? Honk
mhm,
honk, you know? And we saw there that the banks, TD, RBS, all of them went gleefully along with the completely illegal program to seize
mhm.
and freeze people's assets, their bank accounts, right? And in this modern world, if your bank account gets frozen and you can't pay your mortgage on time or your car payment, you're out. You can't buy food. I mean, it's the mark of the beast, right? In sort of biblical terms. So, as they say in my community, never go full Canadian. What happened to Canada in that moment? Are they a test bed, or did they go authentically, you know, nuts?
No, I think the same policies we saw enacted in Canada during that point of time are being piloted around the world. A good example of this would be a public-private partnership managed by the World Economic Forum called the Partnership Against Cybercrime, which involves the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Department of Justice are all members, and they're essentially pursuing these same related efforts to clamp down on what they define as illicit financial activity under the guise of being cybercrime. But they also say, for example, in their documentation, that people that publish misinformation online can be deemed cyber criminals, have their finances seized, and things of this nature. And obviously, that's very concerning going forward. And a lot of these entities propose that banks work directly with intelligence agencies and essentially fuse their operations as it relates to information sharing and analysis. And this is obviously an insane overreach, but it's already happening. For example, Bank of America is a member of that same partnership against cybercrime with the FBI. And on January 6th, Bank of America shared illegally, really, bank activity details with the FBI and Secret Service, so they could go and arrest people that were there on January 6th. So they're already doing that kind of collusion, and they're involved in these partnerships that are not technically overseen by anything involving the US government, but parts of the US government are members. It's one of these global public-private partnerships. And in that particular group is very concerning for another reason, in that they say that one of the ways they need to meet their objectives is by doing things that are currently not legal. that they may need to go beyond things that are currently deemed illegal in order to meet their
Currently
objectives.
legal.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Which is very telling, but that's essentially
Mhm.
where we stand with a lot of these commercial banks. And really historically, for example, if you look at the rise of U.S. intelligence, Wall Street was always an important part of that story. For example, the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, one of the most well-known CIA directors of the early CIA era, is from Sullivan and Cromwell, which is a big Wall Street law firm, for example. And there's been various CIA connections with banks, some of the biggest banks over the years. And it's essentially what we're seeing is an effort to really fuse a lot of these different things together, bring together Wall Street, banking regulators, and Wall Street banking regulators and intelligence agencies. And this was actually laid out by the Carnegie Endowment, the head of which was run at the time by William Burns, who is now CIA director under Biden. And the chair of the Carnegie Endowment is, I believe it's Penny Pritzker, who's essentially responsible for Obama's career and like a big influencer and big bundler for the Democrats specifically. And they essentially gamed out with the World Economic Forum and some of the biggest central and commercial banks in the world how a cyber attack on the financial system would necessitate this fusion of these different entities. So we'll see what happens. There has been a lot of talk of different cyber attacks happening this year from the WEF and from other entities. And what better way for, the financial system, which is sort of on its way to ruin anyway, to absolve themselves of any wrongdoing and point the finger at faceless hackers and then come back as this, newly created financial, completely digitized, financial sector that's openly sharing information with, intelligence agencies and all of that for our security. There's a lot of different initiatives that have been happening in the space for years, and they seem to all kind of be pointing in the same place, which ultimately at the end of the day is centralized power and the end of privacy, and specifically financial privacy.
Now, I'm going to wish them all the luck in the world rebuilding trust because as 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 South Africa found, to move past a breach like that, you need truth and reconciliation, with truth being a critical part. You can't skip the truth part, right? Looks like they just
Yeah.
want to skip over the truth part because, I
Yes.
first reported May 4th, 2020, that this virus came out of a lab. I don't know which one. I never went that far, and I never said was it accidental or intentional, but I can tell you it came out of a lab. The genetic signature was there, was clear cut, right? Ooh, I got trashed, for, I fell afoul of the misdis and malinformation Nazi police right there on YouTube and all that, right? So,
Yeah.
so, um, but they want to seem to skip over the part, which is like, yeah, we did create that thing somehow, and I'm pretty sure it was Ralph Barrick at UNC was the progenitor of that, the godfather of this whole thing. Canada was involved, China was involved. There was like people were involved, but they
Mhm.
want to skip over that. I don't think they're going to be able to rebuild trust. They can try and ram trust down our throats and tell us we have to trust them and punish us when we don't seem to trust them enough. But I don't think they're going to be able to rebuild trust. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so with the current establishment, but this is what I worry about in terms of what I mentioned earlier, when with figures that they have framed increasingly as anti-establishment, that when push comes to shove,
Yeah.
when push comes to shove, they end up serving the establishment anyway. So, Trump, I think, sort of falls in that category. In the sense that his campaign rhetoric in the 2016 election and how he ended up governing, there are drastic differences there. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the same is true for his rhetoric this time, and what is likely to happen if and when he returns to the White House. People seem to have forgotten his defense and role in things like Operation Warp Speed. And he has not come clean about that, or his role in, early lockdowns, mandates, how his administration created a pre-crime program at the Department of Justice called DEEP that was later weaponized against his own supporters and will likely be weaponized against his supporters in the future. Him putting people like John Bolton in as national security advisors after campaigning on being an anti-neocon. being framed by his supporters as not having started any new wars, but there were several attempts to do coups in places like Venezuela and elsewhere, which obviously is not going to solve things like the migrant issue in the Americas, many of whom come from Venezuela. Obviously, a coup there would probably, in violence, would, lead to more disruption, among other things. The wall was not built, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, people assume, especially because of the uh, how he has seemingly regained a lot of this anti-establishment credibility in recent months because of the efforts to remove him from the ballot and things like that. But is that necessarily deserved? Again, I think people really need to remember the difference when it comes to politicians, specifically between campaign rhetoric and governing, because increasingly when Trump was in power, he defaulted to other people around him, specifically people that weren't in cabinet posts, even like Jared Kushner and his daughter Ivanka, for example, and putting in people like William Barr, who's a career CIA mop-up man, in the role of Attorney General. I think things are so dire at this point that can we really hope that Trump will be different this time around? That's essentially, some of the concerns I have. And if there is a big crisis, similar to the COVID event, in Trump is in the White House again, can we trust him not to respond in the way that they want him to, doing something equivalent to Operation Warp Speed again? Frankly, I think the power elite in the United States have consistently been very concerned with a conservative right because they have the lion's share of gun ownership in the United
Hmm.
States. So in order to, I don't think they're under a Democratic administration ever going to go and try and take the guns. What they want is that significant segment of the population to be acquiescent and compliant, and the best way to do that is to make them think that they have won.
So I have to go here because you mentioned William Barr, and of course he covered up the Epstein murder. And my training,
Mm-hmm.
my background is I'm a pathologist. So to have the hyoid bone in three easy pieces, two fractures, I couldn't find any case records where that happened due to hanging, especially not a slump hanging. So that,
Yeah.
I mean, that much was clear. Now, this was exciting to me actually because for the first time I saw Epstein didn't kill himself like as a trending thing, and young people got it. It almost felt like they were in danger of losing control of that story, and I think they did. For a
Yeah.
significant number of people are like, yeah, no, he didn't kill himself, right? He was killed, and then it was covered up, and that was covered up. I need to remind people by the Trump administration,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
you wrote the book One Nation Under Blackmail. It is the Epstein, obviously, my framing is I think that seems clear. He was involved in creating control files. This is part of blackmail.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was that like a little piece or was that a big piece of the overall structure of blackmail, do you think? How
Well,
pervasive
as
is this?
So, blackmail is definitely a thing that has happened, but I think in the modern era, specifically post 2000, the model of sex blackmail that Epstein has become publicly known for is no longer practiced. I think it's entirely digital.
Mm.
And that is why you saw people like Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, particularly after he was arrested the first time in 2006, 2007, move very much into the world of Silicon Valley. So essentially, every Silicon Valley oligarch of significance has either an Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell tie that is very direct and very significant. You had both Google co-founders, Elon Musk, and I believe other tech people as well, subpoenaed as part of the Epstein JP Morgan case that was settled before it could go to trial. And Larry Page essentially disappeared off the planet in order to not be served that subpoena. Jeff Bezos had a very close relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell, for example. If you have a backdoor into the tech infrastructure everyone uses, you have a backdoor into all of their data and their communications, you can probably find something in there that you can use to blackmail people. And if not, you can put something that isn't theirs on there and then blackmail them saying you found compromising information or porn or something on their computer. It opens up a whole different way to compromise people. And I think it's much lower risk for intelligence agencies than what Epstein used to do. And it's a lot less money for them because you don't have to pay someone to maintain this mansion or this island where they can put, influential targets at ease, have these big parties and all of these things where young girls are present. So I definitely think in the modern era, blackmail is all related to data and personal data and Silicon Valley control of that data, essentially. In earlier eras, obviously, sex blackmail was a big part of it, but there was also financial blackmail. There's many different types of blackmail that intelligence agencies have historically used, sex blackmail being perhaps the most salacious of those, but certainly not the only one. And I think in terms of Epstein's career trajectory, sure, obviously the sex blackmail and sex trafficking thing was a component of it, but roughly for half of his operational or time where he was active, doing in his career, really, which if you view him as an actor for intelligence and what have you, it spanned several decades, and roughly one decade was devoted to the sex blackmail stuff, among other things, because it also coincided with various other influence operations that seemed to tie into what he was actually most active in, which were financial markets. Jeffrey Epstein was not a career sex blackmailer, though those have existed in U.S. history. Jeffrey Epstein was really more of a career financial terrorist and tax fraudster, and involved in a lot of insane financial crime and money laundering, allegedly for banks in the 80s that included BCCI. While he was at Bear Stearns in the late 70s and early 80s, he was involved with the power elite and tax schemes, some of which eventually got him fired from there, but he continued his business links and sort of became intimately involved in the world of shadow banking. His main patron, Leslie Wexner, in the late 80s was very involved with Bank One, which later, through after some mergers became JP Morgan. And obviously the world around Wexner and some of his close associates, who were also business associates of Jeffrey Epstein, are responsible for Jamie Dimon being head of JP Morgan, which I think is part of where the JP Morgan Epstein relationship comes from, and part of the reason I think they wanted to settle that case and not have it go to trial, among other things. So, Jeffrey Epstein, and you can look this up because there's been stories written about it, also had a very unusual role in the collapse of Bear Stearns in 2008, which some people have described as an execution of that bank. And it was really, if you believe that narrative, and I think the data supports that, the pin that popped Bear Stearns was Jeffrey Epstein asking for his money back from a very over-leveraged fund. Again, there's all this information you can find if you go and look for it. And oddly enough, at that point in time, Epstein had moved away from Bear Stearns being his main bank to JP Morgan being the main bank, and who picks up the remnants of Bear Stearns for pennies on the dollar? JP Morgan. Very interesting. And you have a lot of involvements, again, with Silicon Valley and financial stuff with Epstein going forward. And I think that's why traditionally, or not traditionally, sorry, but in recent years, efforts to pursue Epstein and the bank relationship, even as it relates to his sex trafficking, have been much harder. I mean, maybe people don't remember anymore, but a few years ago, the son of a judge that was overseeing the Epstein Deutsche Bank case was murdered in her family home. Yes, and that's I think would send a pretty big message, depending on how you feel about it, because the assailant had some very interesting ties that I've written about previously. And of course, this JP Morgan case ended up just, being settled and not actually going to trial. And there were these, but after the case was filed, Biden makes a visit to the USVI, and then their attorney general is fired, and all of these things happening. So I think, they want to avoid a true and honest and open inquiry into Epstein and financial markets, because it would open up a lot of malfeasance that I think they've tried to cover up.
Well, isn't that the basics of investigative journalism since Deep Throat, right? Follow the money, right? I've never seen the money followed, at least in any major publication. And it seems like the easiest, most simple. I mean, this guy had tens of millions of dollars. Where did they come from? Seems like it shouldn't be that hard of a question. And you could follow that and probably find some interesting stuff. But I've never seen a decent accounting yet.
There's no interest in it, frankly. I mean, they'll talk how most of it came from Leslie Wexner, but there's no interest in investigating Leslie Wexner at all, which I think is very significant. As I mentioned earlier, he was very involved in Bank One, which, even before it merged with JP Morgan, was one of the too big to fail banks of prior eras. And had its role in Iran-Contra, even, among other things. And definitely a lot of interesting things going on in Wexner world, who has, been, along with Epstein, one of the main philanthropic forces, donating to leadership courses at Harvard that's directly affiliated with the WEF Young Global Leaders program, among
Hmm.
other things.
Yeah.
And, has focused a lot of his philanthropy on, training future leaders and all of this who, of course, are trained and instilled with the values of whatever Wexner wants them to be. Among other things. And I think also one of the reasons they declined to pursue this is because it leads you to a very interesting nexus of power that involves figures like Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, who Jeffrey Epstein in many ways is very similar to in terms of being a very adept financial criminal. And then one of his close lawyers and confidants, Samuel Pisar, who these days is probably best known for being the stepfather and person who raised Anthony Blinken, the current Secretary of State. Samuel Pisar in the early 70s testified before Congress about what he called the rise of the trans ideological corporation, where he said that the corporate leaders of the United States and the West were essentially forging partnerships with the individuals in the communist bloc countries who ran state-owned enterprises in Russia and China, et cetera, and that they were coming together to create the Trans Ideological Corporation, which was essentially a means of achieving global governance, but not by creating, something like a beefed up United Nations, instead by creating essentially a college of corporations and companies that exerted global financial and economic governance and had more power than any nation state. And essentially talks about this model heralding the end of the nation state. And that he said this directly to Congress in the early 70s. And various affiliations of PSAR, Maxwell and others is obviously related to pursuing those ends over the next several decades. And a big key theme that PSAR outlined to Congress about this was the idea of technology transfer, doing big technology transfers from the West to the East in order to sort of economically equalize and redistribute things. And if you look at Maxwell and PSAR and also Epstein's involvement with the Clinton White House as part of the Chinagate scandal, tech transfers have been going on for a very long time. And this particular nexus has a outsized influence over the deep state of Israel, which is often used the special relationship it has with the US in terms of military technology to acquire that technology and then pass it off to China and adversary nations of the United States. And this is a documented thing. You even had the CIA raise concerns about it in the early 90s, pre-Chinagate and all of this, but really it got out of control at a certain point, and then you have all these efforts to outsource American industry to these same countries to create this global system of interdependence that's essentially managed by these interconnected economic entities that are running the world, and in the banks, among other things. And it's definitely very interesting to study, and I think more people should definitely look at Samuel Pisar and Maxwell in terms of their influence on this. But from my research on it, it involves organized crime, not just the United States, but around the world, in Eastern Europe, in Japan and China, essentially an effort to sort of court organized crime and intelligence agencies around the world to sort of buy into this model. And I think that's definitely part of the story of Epstein, helps explain who he was blackmailing people for and what a lot of the purposes of his activities in financial markets ultimately were.
Now I'm trying to piece all this together. A week and 2 days ago, I was 4 hours up a river in the jungle of Panama at the Darien Gap and at the Kenan Membrillo camp, watching people come out of the jungle for the first time. And it becomes immediately apparent there's a lot of money. There were 61 NGOs there. These poor
Mm-hmm.
people are encouraged to take this very perilous trek, which kills actual percentages of them, to try and make this
Yeah.
trek.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is like, well, why don't they just fly them straight into LAX or something? Like, why force these people to go through this? And you talk to these NGOs, and they said stuff like, oh, this is settled science for them. Oh, migration is a good thing. And it helps to equalize, because you mentioned this equalization. And this is one of their
Mm-hmm.
stated things they want to equalize. But when I think of equalization, I'm just like, okay, so you're going to take really poor people and put them in a rich country, and they're going to send remittances back, which is going to drain the rich
Mm-hmm.
country. So
Yes.
it's actually, they're saying by default, we want to make the rich countries poorer.
Yes.
We
Mm-hmm.
want to impoverish them. That's their
Mm-hmm.
stated plan. It feels intentional. Are they really that dumb, or are they just marching to, like, is this part of, like, we know we need a great reset? I'm trying to like plug this in and make sense of the larger tapestry, because to me it looks like it ends in disaster at the individual level and then at the nation level.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's meant to have a good outcome for the United States at all. I think, honestly, that the border situation on the US-Mexico border in particular is entirely intentional. And nothing has been done to fix it, even by, an administration that came to power campaigning specifically on that issue. And I think it's because it's something that is much bigger. Than the United States itself, because this is something that's happening in a big way in Europe, and it's also happening within Latin America. I live in Chile, and there's a big border crisis here that is on a smaller scale than what's going on in the U.S., but it's similar as well. And Chile is, of course, the most historically prosperous South American country, and there's facilitations of it that are odd, and it's a big political issue here as well. So there's definitely this equalizing tendency via migration is going on in various sectors of the world. Obviously, it has particular agendas. I wouldn't say just one agenda, but agendas tied to it. So I think sort of this
Mhm.
global remittance system is part of this financial system to come, which a lot of the narratives for CBDCs, among other things, and banking the unbanked and all of this stuff is a lot of it uses remittance payments. As its justification. But I also think one of the main goals behind this uncontrolled migration phenomena is related to the push for people to accept digital IDs and biometric identification, to be like, oh, we need to know who's a citizen and who isn't, because we have all these people here now. And the only way to do that is to move to this new system of ID, specifically in the US, where ID is relatively decentralized and it's, by state, not a national, except in the case of a passport, but not everyone in the US has a passport, and a passport isn't required for going around to do your daily things. So I think digital ID is going to be definitely a part of the solution offered to the migration situation. And then I also think there's probably some other things in there as well. In terms of destabilizing urban centers, and just destabilization in general. That way the state can come in and offer various solutions, whether it's digital ID or really whatever they want to stabilize. And that could be things from increased police state behavior. It could really include a lot of different things. But I think digital ID is going to be a big part of it. And I think, sort of this banking the unbanked financial, making this global interoperable cross-border finance system, of which CBDCs are a big part, but definitely not the only part. And, the BIS going through these CBDC trials, multi-CBDC trials, and all of this, it's all about building this global system of interoperable CBDCs, and also, their private sector equivalents like deposit tokens and stable coins to be, sort of traded at mass, and then, surveillable and also programmable, probably. So they, directly intersect with things like carbon markets and all of the stuff that is being developed, in tandem with all of this. So, definitely, I think the migration issue ties in with all of those things. And probably some more. I mean, if I were to think more about it, I could probably come up with a few more, because I think, regardless of the crisis that's being manufactured, they can oftentimes peg really any solution they want to it,
Yeah.
as long as the
Yeah.
narrative is there.
Now, here's the part that confuses me a little. I mean, so, well, listen, if somebody says they're going to do something and then it happens, maybe they did it, right? So, 2016, the WF comes out with their famous little 1.5 minute video, "You'll own nothing and be happy," right? Number
Mm-hmm.
8 in that series caught me the most, though, which said Western values will be tested to the breaking point. Fast forward, this migrant issue, it's clearly breaking societies. They're overwhelming areas culturally, right? In Europe, in
Mm-hmm.
the United States. Whitney, I'm unaware of any efforts to load up boats and put them into China or India or Malaysia. I mean, this feels like a very, like what the West is under assault, but maybe that's just because I live in the West. But that's what it feels like to me right now. Do you have like, why are they targeting the West at this juncture?
Yeah. So I think if you are the powers that be that want increased global governance, you have to force various value changes. And in order to force those value changes, you have to demonize the countries that have the values that you want to replace. So the West, America needs to be the bad guy. And I'm not saying it's not the bad guy. US empire is obviously insanely bad in many ways. But there's going to be a global effort at some point, whether post World War III or whatever, to demonize, values like individual liberty and free markets and all of these things. And I think, making the West increasingly degenerate is going to be a way to point the figure, not just at those countries, but at those values and say these values don't work. I think that's part of what's going on here to an extent.
Well, I consider one of the core values that you might hold as a Westerner is that parents have rights and have a say over how the children are raised in their own household. I saw with an interview you did with Glenn Beck not a long time, but a while ago, and I thought it was just brilliant the way you framed it. That a person, you said, to paraphrase, who is unsure of their own identity at a core level is obviously a very controllable person, or something like that.
Yeah.
Can you explain that further? I thought I just really loved that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of efforts, particularly to target younger generations to sort of have fluid identities. And I mean, probably among the American right, the most consciousness of that is, related specifically to gender identities. But I think it fits into a lot. They've tried to make it fit into a lot of other categories. And, frankly, if no one can really know who they are, or they're not allowed to identify as what they feel they are, then it's very hard to be very grounded. And I think, by having that fluidity sort of programmed into some of these younger generations, the powers that be can manipulate them more easily from one side to the other. And they're not necessarily firmly anchored in a set of values or even, labels or whatever about themselves, that it's all subject to change, which makes, them more easily guided one way or the other, or herded, maybe is the better word, by these power elite figures that have spent decades and decades and funded
Yeah.
a litany of psychologists to, weaponize this stuff against us, frankly.
Yeah, I read as much as I could stomach of Kissinger's 58 PhD thesis, and in there he discusses why revolutions succeed, and they succeed because the revolutionaries push so fast, so far that people are holding the status quo. By the time they wrap their minds around action one, you're on action four, right? So this feels like I feel like I'm in what Brett Weinstein calls, we're in this Cartesian crisis. I don't know who to trust. I don't know that I can even trust, something I see online anymore. I have to source like every image, every video. I don't know. We don't know who to trust. So we have this breakdown, but it feels multi-pronged, right? So they're coming after our children's identity. They're reshaping words, right? Remember under COVID, we lost the ability, like, what's herd immunity? Oh, vaccine needs to be redefined. Like they're constantly redefining words. So we can't have a reasonable conversation, right?
Sure.
Formerly captured territory. Here's what this word means. Oh no, equity means something different now, right? But and then Biden's draining the SPR, and then we have no borders. Can you be a nation if you don't even have a border? On and on and on. Do you see this as is this tapestry of just accidental versus intentional? But this looks intentional. This is what I would be doing if I was writing a fantasy dystopian screenplay for how you take a country down.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's intentional. And I think it's part of this broader effort that I mentioned earlier that sort of became pronounced in the early 70s, this whole trans ideological corporation concept, and that we're really at a point where there are unprecedented efforts to create a system of global governance. And I think the dichotomy that they're trying to make, and I, again, think it's a false dichotomy, is we can either have the current existing unipolar world order, Western dominated, or have this multipolar world order, which is going to be dominated by the BRICS countries. And of course, within BRICS, the dominant countries are Russia and China. And so the idea, it's being framed even, upon independent media. There's some people that claim that the multipolarity model is better because it's more inclusive and more countries have a voice. But ultimately, the same 2030 agenda, or Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals embraced by the EU and the Biden administration, what have you, are also embraced by the BRICS countries that are supposed to represent a challenge to the Western order. So maybe there's a few more seats at the table under the multipolar world order, but in terms of the world that will come in through it, it's the same as if the unipolar world order continues on its way, essentially, because the Sustainable Development Goals have been developed essentially by bankers. You could describe it, or I would describe it, as a global Wall Street coup, essentially. Well, not necessarily Wall Street, but transnational finance. I mean, you have people like Mark Carney, former Goldman Sachs, former head of Bank of England, Bank of Canada, Financial Stability Board, aider and abetter of HSBC's money laundering for drug cartels. He's the person that's in charge of climate action for the United Nations. Their other point man is Mike Bloomberg, former Solomon Brothers, former mayor of New York, billionaire guy. And if you think these people care about the environment and sustainable development and building a more inclusive world, I'm sorry, but you have been had. Larry Fink is in this group too, and he doesn't. I mean, to think that he wants to make a more inclusive world is insane. He's interested in increasing the amount of assets that BlackRock manages, and pretty much only that. So these are the people that are essentially behind a lot of the net zero plans, behind a lot of the other SDG plans that essentially move us from the model, the free market capitalist model, into more this technocratic model where, every commodity, everything is going to be tokenized. And you've seen Larry Fink in the past couple of days be very open about that, following the approval of the BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF, for example, talking about the tokenization revolution and all of this. But there's an effort here to take this, much farther than it's ever been taken before, and to essentially just not just tokenize, existing assets or traditional assets, but also create new asset classes like natural assets, all these natural asset corporations that have sort of been in the news lately and have sort of, received some pushback. But there's definitely a lot of efforts underway to essentially tokenize the whole planet, increase the amount of assets in the existing economy by being like, now this lake is an asset, now this forest is an asset, and all of this stuff tokenize, fractionalize it, and basically create this insane new financial system that's different than previous financial systems. But everything, including nature and humans, will be tokenized and traded like financial products. And that's essentially what a lot of this is leading to. And you have most of the countries on the world, those that are pursuing Agenda 2030, essentially leading us into that. And so, at some level, I think the geopolitical push and pull between, BRICS and the West is real. But I think, at the higher levels, they ultimately agree on the goals. So I don't really think one is necessarily a true effective challenge to the other. And if you're against the ambitions of the SDGs and Agenda 2030, then you should be against them regardless of if they're being championed by Russia and China or the United States and the EU. Ultimately, it leads us to the same place. Which is going to financialize and tokenize everything, but also surveil everything to an unprecedented extent, and increasingly uses, debt slavery. The Mark Carney and Fink and all of these guys, under the auspices of the UN, talked about reimagining the World Bank and the IMF, all the multilateral development banks, for the purpose of basically using debt to finance the SDGs and doing all these things like debt for climate swaps, debt for nature swaps, which are essentially, land grabs and all sorts of things, framing it as, necessary to save the planet. And maybe that justification works for the left, but I think it would be naive to assume that they aren't going to retool the talking points to appeal to the right. I think that's definitely going to be happening. And if you look at Fink himself, he's tried to go away from being the point man for ESG and all of this towards a guy that's saying, like, look how profitable this is going to be for us. And you can have a part of the riches by tokenizing your land and putting it on this platform where it can be traded and whatever. Like, you can have a piece of all this wealth and whatever. I think that's how they're going to try and and frame it. And I think people need to be very aware, because, the efforts to manipulate us to acquiesce to this system are unprecedented. And I think ultimately, if you have a good grasp of what they want to enact on the global stage, regardless of the justifications or the political figures they use, or influencers and media that they try to use to sell this to you, if you are firm in your opposition to these agendas, then you'll be able to sort through the nonsense. Because, as you said, all the stuff coming out online is increasingly just so psyop after psyop after psyop. And, it's hard to know who to trust and who to believe, what have you. But if you know that the end goal is global governance, mass surveillance, the end of privacy, all of that, you can look at who is pushing those agendas and say no. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to say no. You have to know what your red lines are, and you have to make it about trusting your red lines and trusting where you stand, not so much trusting this political savior or that political savior or this media influencer, which I think a lot of people have been doing. And I think it's definitely time for another model, particularly when it comes to US presidential politics, because how many times can we vote for the lesser of two evils and have a good outcome? It's never happened, and it's not going to keep happening. And, all of these efforts, in the case of Trump, to explain away his decisions last time and act like it's going to be different this time. We can't wait to see what's going to happen this time. The situation has come to a head arguably already, and it's up to people to find local solutions and build something with their communities that will help them help everyone in that community protect themselves against all these stressors and crises that are to come. Because waiting for the right guy to get in the White House, regardless of who he is and whatever intention and motivation he has, one guy in the White House is not going to solve all of this, because arguably, the president is really a figurehead, because at this point, the US is so bureaucratic and massive. It doesn't really matter who gets elected, every 4 years in a November. The agenda is going to continue. And I think people need to really get wise about that. And particularly now where, presidential politics is pushed to the forefront of both mainstream and independent media, it's increasing. It really has been for some time a circus at the end of the day. And I think we should be paying attention to these really real issues and increasingly focus on solutions, which I think, finds very little airtime in independent media these days, which I think is definitely a trend I'd like to see reversed, because it's definitely time to start building something parallel to this Agenda 2030 stuff. Because a lot of the way this digital ID stuff, CBDCs or their private sector equivalents, are going to be forced onto the people is when, the food supply is under attack, or, there's some sort of crisis there. And the only way to get your rations is to follow the same model that's been rolled out by the UN's World Food Program, which is essentially the same model produced by Sam Altman's WorldCoin. Scan your eyeball, and you have a digital ID tied to your eyeball in a digital wallet. And every time you check out, you scan your eyeball at the cash register, and it deducts the money of the cost of what you purchased from your, rations wallet. And if you don't submit to that system, you don't eat. And the World Food Program does this to millions of refugees every day in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. And the plan is to have this happen essentially everywhere. So
Now,
people need to be very vigilant.
I agree, and thank you for bringing up my favorite point, which is everybody needs to become resilient. You need to understand where your food is coming from, have some stored up, garden if you can, make sure you have some wealth outside of this banking system, gold,
Yes.
silver. But you have to, the biggest thing, like when we look at the Zimbabwe decline when they had their hyperinflation, when the dust settled years later, somebody asked the question, Philip Pullman asked the question, he said, Philip Hasland asked the question, he said, who thrived? And the answer was people who had deep social networks. It was your social capital that actually was the determinant of success, because you can store some food, but it runs out, right? I mean, over time, you have to, it's who you knew and how well you could trust them. So in the time we have left, I'd like to talk, though, because it feels very, they've got all the chips, seems to be arrayed like they've got all the power, but they're afraid of some things. And so I have a rule in life now. If they want me to do it, I don't do it. And if they don't want me to do it, I do it. And it's a pretty good rule. It mostly works for me, right? So what are they afraid of? I know we've been talking about it. They're afraid of information. They don't like information they don't control. So they disinformation. We know they don't want us gathering and speaking to each other. They don't like the trucker protests. They don't like people coming together. They don't want us
Mm-hmm.
to have defined borders or even a defined sense of self, as you discussed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're definitely afraid of free and fair elections. They hate those, right? Both parties, by the
Sure.
way. I don't think there's two parties. It's one party to me at this stage, but
Yeah,
maybe you have a different position.
I
Um,
don't. Same
so,
position.
yeah, and I can. It's retail level, like, oh, this president, that president. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not the wholesale part. That's the retail part of the story. So where do you detect that they're actually afraid of things, and how do we leverage those?
Yeah, so I think information is a big part of it. And I think there's a lot of different ways to try and use that to our advantage. I think it might be helpful for some people in independent media in the United States to try and stage some sort of low cost return to print, because obviously a lot of the efforts that they're making are in the digital realm. And trying to get us increasingly dependent on that. And I think physical media is going to be important. And I think it's, a good choice too, because, people that read actual physical books, I think there was a study about how that's, better for cognition long term than constantly reading everything on screens.
Hmm.
So I think that would be good. And I think also, there's this definite effort to regulate the internet. And once that happens, the internet of today will no longer exist. And so I think while the internet, even though it's definitely worse off than it probably was several years ago, now is definitely a good time to make offline libraries of things that you think will
Hmm.
be useful, whether it's for things like traditional skills, so you can homestead at some point in the future, or about actual world history, or really any topic of interest. If you can store that offline in a hard drive, so when you want to go and access that information, you don't have to be like, oh, dang it, I have to have a digital ID to access YouTube now, or something like that.
Hmm.
You won't be in that type of position. So I definitely think people should be trying to make essentially information stores your own personal library of Alexandria going forward. And there's also some interesting efforts to try and, I guess, sort of use infrastructure that the elites plan to use going forward to try and allow broad access to information. There's an interesting effort to use the Bitcoin blockchain, for example.
Hmm.
Some of these new, they haven't been programmed yet, but some people have sort of thought out the mechanisms for how to essentially create, basically a WikiLeaks 2.0, and have like information publicly available to everyone by publishing directly onto Bitcoin and stuff like that going forward. I think, if obvious efforts by people like Larry Fink and others to have Bitcoin be an important asset class going forward in the financial realm. So in order for them to stop the information being published there, they would have to nix all of their plans to co-opt Bitcoin and use it as an asset class to back up all of these different things. So that's an interesting case of sort of, using the same technology they want to use essentially against them to allow broad public access to information they don't want in the hands of people. And there's, different ways to I think tackle that, whether it's by building, getting off of big tech and starting to use more like open source alternatives, not necessarily tied to big tech. There's a lot that we can do to try and, get around these issues. But ultimately, we have to get creative about the information war in the information space, because it's definitely one of our best assets and tools in terms of waking people up and trying to stop or mitigate a lot of what's happening, is to try and raise awareness about it, which is obviously through the distribution of information. And so I think, we have to get a lot more creative about that, because traditionally, we've been very focused on these platforms that are very much captured by these Silicon Valley entities that are part of what's happening. And we can't continue to be completely dependent on them if we want to stop what they're doing as it relates to censorship and in this, broader information war. And I think there's, in terms of building parallel systems, we should really be doing that on every level, not just, for information
Hmm.
and big tech. And, as you said earlier, it's really all about building robust local communities that can be resilient and withstand a lot of what's to come.
Absolutely. Very well said. So, Whitney Webb, thank you so much for your time today. What are you working on next? Where do people go to follow you?
Well, all my work is published right now at unlimitedhangout.com. I contribute occasionally to outlets like The Last American Vagabond and also Bitcoin Magazine, among some other places. we're doing some stuff. Well, I recently put out an article on how CBDCs are likely to be implemented in the U.S. and touched on that a little bit in terms of it's likely to be, sort of more related to Wall Street than the Fed. But of course, if you're familiar with how the Fed works, it's owned by Wall Street anyway, so not
Hmm.
really that different at the end of the day. How it relates to FTX, the collapse of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, and some of his ambitions to create basically a U.S. stable coin, among other things, and trying to get the DNC and regulators to be on his side with that. And because they're going to king make which ones, make it in, who gets to be the digital dollar and what have you. And I think people are kind of naive that if we can just defeat central bank issued currencies in the sense of, direct issued CBDCs, then we win. But if you, for people that actually have looked at what's going on, there's a lot of different ways that they're trying to essentially create the same system under different names. So I guess I've been doing a lot of stuff related to finance. I have some Epstein stories coming out in over the next month or two, a lot of which are related to financial stuff and his activities in the Virgin Islands, among other things. And hopefully some, other impactful pieces coming forward.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for all the work you do in the world. You've got a lot of fans on within my audience and with my fiance. She said to say hi, and that she really admires you.
Well,
So
hi. Thank you.
that's Evie. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
Thanks, my pleasure. Thanks.